The drawing compass, or pair of compasses, was an essential tool of the pre-modern artist. Indeed, it was often cast as the creative instrument par excellence. Many of you will be familiar with illuminations like that of the Holcomb Picture Bible, which evoke biblical passages in which God wields a compass. Like Proverbs 8:27, quote, with a certain long compass, certa lege e gyro, he enclosed the depths. Or Job 26:10, he has set the bounds, circumdedit, about the waters, till light and darkness come to an end. By placing one point of the compass on the outline of the circular sky, the Holcomb artist aligns divine and artistic creation action. But something's off. Taking an actual compass to the printed copy of the image confirms this intuition. The foot of God's compass lies just right of the center. To draw the three circles that contain the image, the artist put his compass first here, then here, and finally here. Thus, the origin of the area empyrean lies in the figure's nose, the organ of breath, that of the world in his belly or umbilicus, and the hellmouth his groin. The alignment seems intentional, as if the artist could rely on his viewers to seek and find the true centers of these circles, and with them the deeper significances of its picture. Such assumptions draw our attention to what circles implied. Encountering a perfect curve, we, and likely pre-modern audiences before us, reflexively look for the telltale trace, a dimple or puncture, left by the sharpened tip of a compass's standing leg. Hence, just as the Holcomb Christ in Majesty indicates the circle with his compass, so I would argue every circle or arc indicates a compass. And not only circles. In his influential etymologies, Isidore of Seville maintained that the perimeter of every figure was enclosed within the circle. The full truth of this statement will be known to anyone who has tried their hand at constructing complex polygons with compass and rule, or who have encountered the work of today's speaker. Professor Robert Bork is a historian of medieval art with a particular focus on Gothic architecture. He teaches in the School of Art and Art History at the University of Iowa. Originally trained as a physicist, Bork earned his PhD in architectural history from Princeton University. He wrote his dissertation on the development of Gothic church spires, research that gave rise to 3 books, Great Spires in 2003, The Geometry of Creation in 2011, and Late Gothic Architecture in 2018. Bork has additionally edited several volumes for the Avista Late Medieval Studies Society and published numerous articles in journals, among them Art Bulletin, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Architectural Histories, and Res. His work has been supported by the University of Iowa, the American Philosophical Society, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts. It was largely through reading Bork, especially his Geometry of Creation, that I began thinking circularly. That is, to understand the sequence of geometrical operations, many involving a compass, that underlie much medieval design. It is thus my sincere pleasure to introduce his talk today, titled Circles Below the Surface, the Role of the Compass in Pre-Modern Creativity. Please join me in welcoming Robert Bork.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's a particular pleasure to finally address you all, even from afar, after the year that we've all been through. In any case, I'm both delighted and honored to open this conference, since compasses have had a special place in my heart ever since I started learning to draw as a child. By facilitating the creation of perfect circles, compasses help to bring order out of chaos, as God himself illustrates in the famous image at right from a 13th century Bible Moralisée. In the 15th century tomb of the Rouen architect Alexandre de Berneval, similarly, the master holds his compass up against a quadrant of the rose window scheme he drew with it. While overtly circular patterns like these clearly show the most obvious results of compass use. I will demonstrate in my talk today that such examples only begin to hint at the ubiquity of the compass as a pre-modern design tool. I will show, for instance, that compass-based design practices help to govern the proportions in this design for Strasbourg Cathedral's west facade, and not just its rose window. I will also show that circle making informs the design not only of overtly circular English monuments such as Stonehenge, but also the proportioning of various noteworthy artworks preserved in London, including the Lindisfarne Gospels, a parchment tower plan from Ulm Minster, and the painting below by Piero di Cosimo. I had chosen these examples when the conference was originally being planned in the hope that we might actually be able to see them together. And I decided to stick with these examples even now, thinking that many of you may be able to see them in the near future, even if I'm not able to join you. Finally, at the end of my talk, I will further demonstrate that similar compositional principles inform even some modern works, such as the paintings of Pierre. Before getting into these examples, I should briefly describe a few of the more common compass-based constructions that we will see in them. At top center, you see a diagram showing the nesting of a square within a circle inscribed within a larger square. This kind of square nesting, known as quadrature, creates a size ratio between the squares equal to 0.707, which in modern parlance we would call the cosine of 45 degrees, or 1 over the square root of 2. When you nest octagons analogously in the format shown at upper right, which I call octature, the equivalent ratio is 0.924, which is the cosine of the 22.5 degree angle seen in the octagon. At the bottom of the slide, finally, you see that unfolding the half diagonal of the square creates a rectangle with a height to base ratio of 1.618, which is known as the golden rectangle because it has the special property that it can contain an infinite series of harmonically nested squares, as seen at lower right. The presence of such ratios in works of art and architecture can provide evidence for the use of compasses in their construction, as I will demonstrate. One valuable document that hints at the use of compasses, even in the construction of non-circular artifacts, is the Booklet on Pinnacle design, published by Matthias Frotzer in 1486. Reading downward in the left column of this graphic, you can see that the first steps in creating the ground plan of the pinnacle are constructing a square, constructing a rotated square within it, and then a still smaller square within that. Then in the bottom left figure, the middle-sized square is rotated back into alignment with the bigger and smaller ones, creating a quadrature sequence that would have been created in practice with a compass. Once the ground plan of the pinnacle was fully elaborated, its form was extruded into the vertical dimension, with the height being counted out as multiples of the base dimension. To see how this principle could be applied in practice to something larger than a pinnacle, I'll start by considering Strasbourg Plan B, the drawing that set the direction of the Strasbourg Cathedral workshop in the late 13th century. Plan B will always have a special place in my heart because it was consideration of this drawing that launched my sustained inquiry into Gothic design geometry 2 decades ago. What you see at left is an elaborated redrawing published in the 19th century. At right, you now see the medieval original, which shows only half of the contemplated facade and which was more carefully drawn in its lower section than it was at the top. This difference of facture has led some scholars to believe that the two sections were conceived separately, perhaps even decades apart, as indicated in the central graphic, which contrasts the full scheme in its right half with the presumably original lower section in its left half. In an attempt to resolve the question of the drawing's conceptual unity, I began a geometrical inquiry, starting at the spire base where the two zones of the drawing meet. In examining the drawing, I noticed 2 compass prick marks. Such overt traces of compass use were eliminated in many later Gothic drawings, likely by the temporary placement of a protective layer under the compass point during the drawing process. But in Plan B, these holes offer valuable clues about the design's geometrical logic. The distance between them equals half the side length of the square framed by the pinnacle doublets and sitting on the boxy story below. When rotated onto a diagonal, that square defines both the height of the pinnacle doublets and the width of the boxy story, both of which belong to the original part of the drawing. At the same time, The intersections between the rotated squares define the edges of the octagonal drum in the first story of the spire. I'll consider the spire geometry only after we look at the original parts of the drawing below. The front and lateral faces of the tower buttresses are equal in size. Surprisingly, however, the tracery panels on the front faces of buttresses are subtly asymmetrical. Their inner panels are slightly smaller than the outer ones, as you see in this detail. We can begin to understand this anomaly if we circumscribe a circle around the octagon framed by the pinnacle pairs. The vertical tangents to this circle define the axes in the tracery, while the horizontal tangent describes the bottom of the molding terminating the boxy story below. This means that octagons and their circumscribing circles played important roles in defining even the original parts of the drawing. We see these same figures repeatedly as we descend step by step through the facade stories. Here, for example, you see that the boxy tower story is a square, and the facets of the octagon inscribed within this square define the heights of the windows in the story and of the pinnacles over the rows. The organization of the lower facade can perhaps be more clearly seen in this high contrast black and white image. Without belaboring the details, I will note that the rose fits into an octagon of the same size seen in the tower, and that its frame corresponds to the circumscribing circle, and the same interval defines the thickness of the white star octagon framework, whose corners help to establish the triforium. An identical figure immediately below has a center corresponding to the center of the tracery roundel above the side portal. It is clear, therefore, that a geometry of stacked octagons governs the organization of the lower and presumably original part of the drawing. I soon found that exactly the same system also governs its controversial spire zone. The gable tips can be found with 45-degree lines rising from the frame of the pinnacle pairs, and the finials above them fit neatly within a red box stacked atop the original black one. Moving upward, the shaded red arc defines the level on which the tip of another star octagon rests. The upper and lower facets of this octagon define the ends of the slender shaft in the pencil-like tower. Just below the top of the shaft, there is another prominent compass brick point, which sits at the lower tip of a small star octagon whose facets match the top of the shaft. The significance of this level becomes obvious only after we consider the top of the drawing. The sloping sides of the truncated spire would converge at a point exactly 2 units above the prick point, where a unit here again equals the space between the pinnacle pairs drawn by the first draftsman. In sum, a unified geometrical armature of stacked octagons governs the drawing from ground line to spire tip. On this basis, the elaborated redrawing I showed you before begins to look like a plausible depiction of the original designer's intent. I suspect that this first draftsman may even have scribed the blind lines that guided the work of his less meticulous followers who inked the spire zone. The precise history of the drawing's production admittedly remains obscure, but I feel very confident about my geometrical analysis, in part because the compass holes provide such tangible confirmation of the draftsman's working method. Once I completed my study of Plan B, I became fascinated by the potential of such research to reveal the geometrical logic of other monuments and artifacts. In the rest of my talk, therefore, I will walk you in roughly chronological order through a series of examples from prehistory to the present, drawing mostly on my own work, but also citing other scholars whose work in this area I admire. I will start by mentioning Anthony Johnson's analysis of the Bush Barrow lozenge, an incised gold sheet some 19 centimeters long, buried in a grave of the 18th century BC, roughly a kilometer to the south of Stonehenge. Johnson argues persuasively that the makers of the lozenge used compasses to establish its proportions, and he provides a detailed step-by-step recipe showing how its angular form was created by connecting the intersection points between compass-drawn circles, as you can begin to see here. In the interest of time, I'll pass in silence over the details of these steps, but we can return to such examples in the Q&A period if people are interested. Johnson also provides a compelling geometrical analysis of Stonehenge itself, which was already standing when the lozenge was made. Its overall circular form, of course, was not constructed with a giant compass. but the use of ropes and stakes would have allowed its builders to create accurate circular arcs in a conceptually equivalent way. Johnson notes the 56-sided polygon defining the so-called Aubrey holes belonging to the oldest part of the complex would have been developed from an initial octagonal form as shown here. The 4 so-called station zones, similarly, lie on the vertices of an octagon created by a square and circle geometry, anticipating that used by Gothic builders millennia later. Johnson argues, finally, that the U-shaped layout of the Great Sarsen stones was established by creating a pattern of intersecting circular arcs, as shown here. Although I cannot claim any expertise in prehistoric archaeology, I was pleased to incorporate Johnson's work on Stonehenge into a graduate seminar on geometrical design methods that I offered a few years ago. In the same course, I began to work with a student on the geometry of rock-cut tombs in Petra, Jordan, including the so-called treasury or Kazna seen here, which dates to the 1st century AD. It soon became clear that a simple quadrature sequence linked the dimensions of the central door opening to the double square framing the axes of the lower columns, whose shaft height can be called 1 unit. The bases of the upper columns lie at height 1.618, which is the golden ratio. The monument itself obviously was not carved with a giant compass, but the proportions could have been set with a compass in the preparatory drawings, as the orange arc in the center of the image suggests. The height of the lower capital, similarly, seems to have been set with an arced construction. Analogous geometries govern the upper half of the Kazna as well. Instead of taking time to unpack these details, I should pivot to at least briefly mention the largest power in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Romans were able to expand their authority not only through military and political means, but also through the construction of roads, bridges, and impressive infrastructure projects like the Pontugard Aqueduct, many of which incorporated round arches that were surely designed with compasses. The Pantheon, of course, stands as one of the most spectacular examples of the Roman capacity for circular thinking, so I will just let this picture speak for itself. The elongated shape of amphitheaters like the Colosseum was more subtle. Scholars continue to debate whether their arenas were planned as true ellipses, which would be compressed circles, or whether their builders only approximated this form using ropes to create circular arcs. The latter option was certainly simpler to construct, and it had the added advantage of keeping a standard depth to the ranks of seating, as the diagram here indicates. After the decline of the Roman Empire, early medieval designers were unable for centuries to rival the scale of the Pantheon of the Colosseum, but they did become highly creative in their use of compasses. Irish high crosses, like the one from Maheny, exemplify this idea. The geometrical logic behind this design tradition has been studied by scholars including Robert Stevick, whose step-by-step unfolding of the cross you see here. Stevick shows that sequences of simple geometric operations performed only with compass and straight edge suffice to govern the composition. Stevick has also shown that very similar logic informs the design of insular jewelry and manuscripts. Here, for instance, is his sequential development of the terra brooch frame design. And here is his treatment of a carpet page from the Lindisfarne Gospels. If this tradition of geometrical design was well established across a range of small-scale media already in the early Middle Ages, then it would make sense to find its traces in architectural contexts as well. Eric Ferning has argued, for example, that the proportions of 9th century St. Gall monastery plan were based on the unfolding of diagonals from squares, which produces proportions based on the square root of 2. Similar proportions are also seen in Gothic design, as I already began to show with my discussion of Strasbourg Plan B. Among the oldest surviving architectural drawings of the Gothic era are those made by the 13th century draftsman Pierre, such as the plan of Laon Cathedral's tower seen at right. This plan lacks the geometrical precision characteristic of most later Gothic drawings. Its geometrical structure, however, can be readily deciphered. To show this, I here begin by drawing a square large enough to frame the plan and rotated squares within it. If I rotate the middle square back into standing position, which a medieval draftsman would have done with a compass, I can create a shaded area between the two inner squares. This shaded area corresponds to the thickness of the wall structure in the little tower plan. If I simply extend the walls out to meet the framing square, I get the buttress depths, while an octagon within the wall structure describes the spire base. These blue shadings again match well with Viard's drawing. Finally, I add black octagons to describe the aediculae alongside the main spire. Their sides describe the diagonal facets in Viard's plan. You may note at upper right that Viard originally got this wrong, drawing a diagonal between the outer corners of the buttress blocks that I've shown in blue, before doing his best to erase his error. Viard's plan of the Long Tower presents strictly objective information, while the corresponding exterior view of the tower uses pseudo-perspectival depth cues to suggest a subjective view from below. More broadly, the exterior view appears grossly distorted in its proportions, with overlarge tabernacles squeezing the central window. The two drawings, however, share surprisingly similar geometrical logic. The exterior fits into a perfect double square, while the plan, of course, fits into a single square. Rotated squares within the exterior view pick out the mysterious hand 1/4 of the way up the tower, and the salient ox 3/4 of the way up. The same basic framework also governs the elevation of the actual little tower, seen at right, although the actual tower geometry involves star octagons, whose corners align with details including the capitals and bases of the upper aediculae, the capitals of the lower aediculae, the division between the two main stories, and the height of the lower tower story. As the circles around these star octagons indicate, they would have been created with compasses in the original drawing, which does not survive. Viard's exterior view thus captures the basic outlines of the tower scheme, but not its details. This is not surprising, since the pseudo-perspectival subjectivity of Viard's drawing contrasts dramatically with orthogonality seen in most actual Gothic elevation drawings. As we've already seen, for instance, Strasbourg Plan B presents a strictly frontal view of the depicted facade, in which the proportions are once again based on the stacking of star octagons. The somewhat later Cologne Plan F, seen at left, has an even more rigorously consistent geometrical armature made of stacked octagons. The bottom story of the facade appears shorter than the others, only because its governing octagon extends slightly underground. This format results, I believe, from the fact that the octagon was circumscribed around an even more basic geometrical figure, the square on the ground line framed by the main buttress uprights. One parchment piece in Plan F corresponds to each octagonal module. The relationship between the drawing, the parchment structure, and the geometrical armature is particularly striking in the upper third of the drawing. The width of the parchment in this zone corresponds to the diameter of a secondary octagon inscribed within this armature. Very similar geometries, as it turns out, govern the geometry of this ceremonial sword from Cologne, which has been carefully studied by the Swedish swordsmith Peter Johnson. The hilt of the sword, in particular, incorporates octagon-based geometries closely related to those seen in Plan F. Interesting as these cross-medium studies may be, I want to spend the next portion of my talk in the territory I know best, looking at another Gothic architectural example. In particular, I want to discuss the role of the compass in planning for the Great Tower of Ulm Minster, which was begun shortly before 1400 and which was finally completed as the tallest church tower in the world in 1890. You'll note that the lowest level includes a porch with 3 arched openings, flanked by 2 main buttresses at the tower corners, while higher up the tower plan shifts to octagonal. At left, you now see a plan of the whole church with its massive square plan base of the tower at the bottom. I offer this graphic for orientation because the drawing we're going to explore is a bit hard to read. This ground plan of the tower base is kept in London at the Victoria and Albert Museum. To understand its geometrical logic, it makes sense to begin with the axes of its main buttresses. The thickness of each buttress equals 1/4 of the space between them. The overall plan of the tower base is a simple square, as you might expect. More surprisingly, though, there's a slight but distinct shift in buttress axes, as I hope you can see in the detailed view at right. I'm talking about the tiny gap between the solid and dotted vertical lines near the buttress center. To understand the origin of this small but deliberate distinction, I will show you a second plan drawing closely related to the one from the V&A. The drawing at right, which is still preserved in Ulm, is a near twin of the London drawing. The basic wall thicknesses are the same in both. In the right drawing, however, you can see the octagonal outline of the tower superstructure. To explore this format, I here add octagons to each drawing framed by the major buttress axes. And here, bringing the compass back into the picture, I have circumscribed circles around those octagons. Next, in each drawing, I inscribe a larger octagon and a larger circle framed by the outer surfaces of the tower base. The large circles cut the radial lines of the octagon corners and tower corners in the pairs of points I've picked out with white dots. Verticals projected downwards from those white dots describe the lateral surfaces of the upper tower buttresses, which are displaced from the buttress surfaces at ground level. The slight but pronounced local shift in buttress axes I noted previously, therefore, actually reflects the geometry of large circles that were used in creating the plan, but not drawn explicitly onto it. As the numerical labels in the left graphic now indicate, that shift reduces the span between the upper buttress axes to 0.979 of the span at ground level. The consequences of this subtle shift can also be seen in the elevation of the tower, shown at right in the 15th century drawing known as Ulm Plan C. The unitalicized numbers along its left margin count out its height from ground level using the buttresses span at that level. In describing the upper tower and spire, however, it is more appropriate to measure using the slightly smaller span between the upper buttress axes. In these italicized units, the height of the tower superstructure is exactly 5 units, and the intervals between the crockets on the spire are exactly half a unit each. The Ulm spire design thus expresses in more complex form precisely the same design principles of plan development and module stacking seen in the Pinnacle designs left, which Rohrster published within a decade of the Ulm drawing's production. Very similar design principles also govern this magnificent spire drawing, which rather amazingly came to light only a few years ago, when it was displayed at the Sam Fogg Gallery in London before being sold to the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. Like the long drawings by Pierre that we considered previously, it incorporates pseudo-perspectival depth cues. Its governing geometry, though, involves the stacking of crystalline modules based on its ground plan, just as one sees in the Ulm drawings or Roritzer's pinnacles. As this detailed view shows, moreover, the proportions of the successive stories were set by compass-based constructions that I call octature. This is visible, for instance, in the size of the corner pinnacles, whose ground plans I show you as white squares, and whose sides are inset from the framing square by one octature factor of 0.924. I cannot close the architectural section of my talk without mentioning that yet another magnificent and previously unknown architectural drawing has recently been acquired by the Sam Fogg Gallery. This 3-meter high drawing shows an elaborate sacramental tabernacle with fourfold symmetry, whose proportions are thus set by quadrature, as the linear armature indicated in the detailed view of its lower half shows at right. In the final section of my talk, I will discuss how similar design principles have been deployed in painting. I first began to think about this topic almost by accident a decade ago, when my friend Norbert Nussbaum asked me to explore the geometry of the cusped architectural frame on this crucifixion, painted by the so-called Veronica master, who worked in the Rhineland early in the 15th century. I began by establishing the baseline of the cusped arches. Next, I picked out the axes of the pinnacles between the arches. My first clue that something really interesting was afoot came when I dropped diagonals from the bases of those pinnacles, only to find the base of the painted cross. I had not expected the geometry of the frame to have anything to do with the composition of elements in the panel. As you can see, however, the golden ground of the panel is a perfect double square if one measures to the borders defined by the pinnacle axes and not to the edges defined by the lower frame. The baseline of the panel can be found by circumscribing circular arcs around those squares. That already struck me as pretty interesting because it implied more coordination between the panel and frame designs than I had expected, but this was only the beginning of the panel composition. Here I've just added yellow verticals through the square centers. Green diagonals from the lower corners of the panel pass along the mouth of the Virgin and the eyes of St. John to meet Christ's chest. The two sets of diagonals intersect at the level of the saint's hands, indicated here by a green horizontal. When I add these blue circles through the previously established points, as I would if using a compass on a preparatory drawing, I find a new level, one that runs through the saint's eyes. Their feet lie on the blue horizontal through the points where the green diagonals cut the yellow arcs. These blue verticals, I believe, help to govern the patterns of drapery in the saint's robes, but I understand that some of you may be skeptical about this because the folds are so irregular. I can get a kind of quasi-architectural clarity, though, when I look at sharply defined elements like the cross. The width of the cross equals the diameter of a circle struck from the intersection point on Christ's chest down to the green horizontal, hinting again at use of compasses in the establishment of this composition. Each of the angels, meanwhile, sits on a geometrical armature defined by the circles describing the arches of the frame, with the four outer ones seemingly twining around these circles. Their heads and the bottom edge of the cross's horizontal beam all lie on the purple level defined by the diagonals within those circles. Many of you may be wondering whether traces of these forms are visible in underdrawings on the panel. The answer, unfortunately, is no, but I don't find that too surprising. I am showing these circles explicitly to illustrate the logic of the design, but the creators of the panel would have no need to mark all of them on its surface. Like their architectural colleagues, they could have established the proportions of their composition just by marking a few key points. I was lucky to have started my career in geometrical analysis by looking at Strasbourg Plan B, a drawing that happened to include prominent compass prick points. But having achieved good success with the analysis of drawings where such prick points were lacking, I was not troubled by their absence in this panel. In any case, Norbert kindly presented my results at a conference in Cologne in 2011 that I was unable to attend in person, where people were supposedly intrigued, but not enough to actually contact me. In the course of turning that talk into an article, I thus began what has been a rather lonely exploration of geometry and painting. Although solid documentation of this compositional practice seemed to be scarce, I had the impression that lots of bad work had been done in this field, and so I wanted to find something disreputable to serve as a foil for my own work. I thought I had found a perfect target when I stumbled across Charles Boulot's 1963 book, The Painter's Secret Geometry, since it had a sensationalist title and a broad scope, sweeping from the early Middle Ages to the 20th century. After exploring its pages, though, I found that I had to modify my dismissive attitude. The page that really changed my opinion was the one showing Boulot's analysis of this miniature from the Trévicheur of Jean de Berry, made by the Limburg brothers early in the 15th century. Here Adam and Eve are shown in the Garden of Eden, whose circular perimeter was surely drawn with a compass. More interestingly, Boulot showed that the height of the Gothic fountain of life in this image could be found by unfolding the diagonal of the square framing the garden's circular border. What really blew my mind, though, was Boulot's demonstration that the width of the fountain was set by the intersection of two pentagons inscribed within that circle. In the lower left of the image, moreover, Adam's foot locates the corner of the pentagon with the horizontal base. Boulot extends that baseline to the right, as I've shown in green, and then connects it back to the tip of the fountain. The intersection of this green diagonal within the circle's equator, he claims, sets the width of the Gothic portal through which the first couple exit, while the blue diagonal to its top sets the sloping pose of the expelled Eve. Although Boulot's wide-ranging book includes some analyses that I see as unreliable, I feel that its arguments deserve far more attention and critical engagement than they have received to date. I made this observation in my article on the geometry of vintage painting, but that article has also attracted little attention of its own. Since I found that reception discouraging, I probably would have let this topic alone indefinitely, had I not spent the 2014-2015 academic year on fellowship at the National Gallery in Washington, which was hosting an exhibition of paintings by Piero di Cosimo, a Florentine active in the decades around 1500. One of the most impressive paintings in the show was this visitation scene, which belongs to the gallery. Prompted by a question from one of the gallery conservators, I began to consider its aspect ratio and geometrical layout. The inner field of the painting is a perfect square, flanked by narrow strips on the bottom and sides. The center of the square locates the clasping hands of the Virgin and Elizabeth. The center of the square also defines a level, identified here with the orange horizontal, that describes the edge of the architectural platforms on which the small figures in the middle ground stand. From the ends of that horizontal, I have launched orange lines of 30-degree slope. Then, from the points where those orange lines intersect the top of the panel, I've dropped yellow verticals, which I've used to frame a yellow circle in which I've inscribed a yellow square in a quadrature operation. You'll note that the bottom facet of the square aligns with the back of the platform on which the Virgin and Elizabeth stand. The front of the platform corresponds to the bottom tip of a green equilateral triangle, whose baseline corresponds to the equator of the square. A similar triangle above this equator helps to locate the heads of the two women as they lean toward each other, with their wimples sloped at 60 degrees from the horizontal. I would also observe that their heads and the Virgin's halo fit into the almond-shaped figure that circumscribes the paired triangles. One odd detail about this painting is that the horizon line of the seascape in the deep background between the two women is not actually horizontal. Instead, it falls gently from left to right. I'm tempted to imagine this might have been because the artist connected the wrong lines in his geometrical armature. Here I've added blue lines of 30-degree slope from the equator of the panel, and I note that I get the skewed horizon line quite precisely if I connect the point at left where the rising blue line intersects the yellow vertical, with the point at right where the falling blue line intersects the side of the green triangle. While some of these details must obviously remain conjectural, I felt confident that I'd gained significant insight into the panel's composition, and because I found these results exciting, I began to explore the geometries of other paintings in the show. Here, for example, is Piero di Cosimo's depiction of the Virgin and Child adored by saints, including Elizabeth of Hungary at left and Catherine at right. The panel is a perfect square, and you'll note that a circle inscribed within this square swings tantalizingly along the side of the cloud at upper left and along the Puto's wing at right. This circle can be understood as just the first in the sequence of compass-drawn quadrature steps. The base of the orange square inscribed within the red circle coincides with the edge of the lowest step on the Virgin's throne, and the left and right midpoints of that square locate the hands of Saints Peter and John, who flank the composition. Here I have also added rays subdividing the composition into 24 equal wedges. You'll note that these align with elements including the outer visible tiles in the floor in front of the throne. Continuing inwards, we can begin to see how further concentric circles divide the saints into ranks of proximity to the child. Only Elizabeth and Catherine, for example, have faces within the green square. And only Catherine's hand penetrates into the blue circle that frames the child. The bend of her fingers aligns with the same violet square that frames the child's leg, and her fingertips penetrate just beyond the circle that frames his shoulder. It's easy to find further details, such as the horizon line, within this framework, but I will resist the temptation to discuss them at the moment. Instead, I will briefly mention the far simpler composition of another painting by Piero di Cosimo, the satyr and nymph that can be seen in London at the National Gallery. As you can see, the overall proportions of the panel are set by simply unfolding the diagonals of two side-by-side squares. The foliage at the left and right edges of the panel actually follows the red arcs produced by this procedure, which was surely laid out with a compass. You'll note also that elements such as the satyr's arm and the dog's nose align with the diagonals of the boxes, while the dog's foreleg aligns with the boundary box of the right. A very simpler compositional strategy governs this famous but anonymous Renaissance cityscape, which is now preserved in Baltimore. It has the same overall proportions as the London panel. In this case, however, the squares seem to have been set on the exterior of the composition and the arcs on the interior. You'll note, for example, that the right margin of the left square aligns with the central axis of the amphitheater in the distance. In the coming few slides, I'll alternate between adding lines to top and bottom copies of the panel. Several key elements in the painting can be found by tracing lines of 30-degree and 60-degree slope upward from its outer lower corners. The right margin of the amphitheater aligns with the vertical, where the 30-degree line cuts the left arc, and the left margin can be found by reflection. The baptistry at right fits into a nearly equivalent frame, although it is compressed slightly to the right. The front corners of the palaces in the foreground can be found by first drawing a yellow horizontal through the point where the 30-degree orange line cuts the axis of the amphitheater, and then drawing yellow verticals through the circled points halfway between the intersections of this horizontal with the 45 and 60-degree lines. The rear corners of the palaces are exactly halfway between the panel margin at center, as the green verticals indicate, and the green horizontal line can be found at the level where the rising green lines of 30-degree slope cut the orange margins of the amphitheater and the baptistry. The top edge of the right-hand palace can be found by running a blue line from the vanishing point to the top of the yellow vertical describing the right-hand palace corner. From the point where this blue line cuts the orange line of 60-degree slope, a blue vertical can be dropped to find the axis of the column in the foreground, and a similar construction also works in the left half of the panel, even though the palace there is shorter. The perspectival lines in the pavement can be found by connecting the vanishing point to already constructed points in the foreground, and a similar scheme located at the front edge of the platforms on which the palaces stand. Before moving on to consider other more recent examples, I cannot resist sharing my analysis of one more Italian Renaissance painting. Here is the so-called Brera altarpiece, painted by Piero della Francesca, showing the condottiere Federico da Montefeltro in adoration of the Virgin and Child surrounded by saints. Piero della Francesca is famous for his writings on perspective and solid geometry, but I believe this composition was actually governed by a simple two-dimensional geometrical scheme, whose logic would have been familiar to any compass-wielding Gothic architect or early medieval craftsman. To show this, I'd like to start out by pointing a few details of the painting. First, its sides have been slightly trimmed, and the elbows of St. John the Baptist at left and of Andrew at right thus appear slightly truncated. Second, these two saints hold their attributes in ways that serve as geometrical markers, which is particularly conspicuous in the case of the Baptist staff. Both the staff and Andrew's book are aligned at 22.5 degrees from the vertical. Together, they thus describe the converging sides of a triangle with an interior angle of 45 degrees, which can be understood as 1/8 of a regular octagon. The baseline of this triangle, I believe, corresponds to the original width of the panel, as the red verticals here indicate. To buttress this contention, I'll now show you that a related construction correctly gives the height of the panel. Here at the top of the image, I've drawn 5 facets of an orange octagon centered on the apex of the red wedge and framed by the red verticals. The upper corners of the octagon's lateral facets locate the top edge of the panel. In the bottom half of the image, I've drawn an orange circle within the square left over beneath the octagon's lateral facets, and I've inscribed a square within that circle. You'll notice that the vertical facets of the square locate the corners of the pilasters on the wall behind the saints, and that its top facet locates the bottom edge of the pilaster capitals. Next, I've taken another quadrature step inwards by inscribing a yellow circle within the square and a yellow square within the new circle. Note that the Virgin's blue cloak just fills the arc of the yellow circle. The right lower corner of the yellow square locates Federico's elbow, and at the left yellow vertical defines the midline of St. Jerome's bifurcated garment. Here I've constructed a network of equilateral triangles comparable to what we saw in the Piero di Cosimo Visitation. One large green triangle, sharing its baseline with the yellow square, has its upper vertex in the Virgin's left eye socket, since she inclines her head slightly to one side as she gazes at her child. The child's body lies along a 30-degree slope departing from Federico's elbow, which also locates the elbow of the angel to the left of the Virgin. The comparable point on the right locates the hand of St. Francis. In the upper section of the panel, meanwhile, I've used octature to create a new green horizontal just above the orange one by inscribing arcs within the lateral edges of the orange octagon. This new green horizontal matters because it serves as the geometrical baseline for the painting's upper architectural structure. You can already see that it coincides with the top edge of the entablature on either side of the main niche. By constructing nested blue octagons and semicircles centered on this level, and framed by the orange uprights, moreover, I can determine both location and the thickness of the arch over the main niche. The large blue arc circumscribing the orange octagon and sweeping through the Virgin's face also locates the eye level of most of the saints. This relationship is only approximate, but the bottom point on this arc also serves quite precisely as the point of convergence for the perspectival system defined by the converging lines of the entablatures, as the blue raking lines along those entablatures indicate. There's certainly more that can be said about this system, but I think that the steps I've described already give you a good idea of how I see this composition evolving. Now, if you believe what I've been saying about the use of geometrical armatures in medieval architecture and Renaissance painting, then you probably won't be surprised to find evidence for this tradition continuing into the 17th century. The famously poised compositions developed by Jan Vermeer, for example, seem clearly to have some sort of geometrical order. This painting of a young woman holding a balance was developed around a recursive quadrature system, similar to the one we saw in Piero di Cosimo's Enthroned Virgin. In this case, the outermost red square locates the bottom edge of the wall, and the next squares inward locate the bottom of the woman's mantle, the front edge of the table, and the back edge of the table. Her fingers holding the balance, not surprisingly, fall exactly at the geometrical center of the quadrature sequence. Again, there are further details we could discuss, but I'll now skip a few centuries forward to demonstrate just how long this compass-based method of composition seems to have remained in vogue. Here, for instance, you can begin to see that Edward Hopper used a quadrature scheme while composing Nighthawks in 1942. The overall proportions of the painting are set by creating a large square in its right half, swinging the diagonal downwards to form a large arc, and mirroring the arc on the far left. This procedure creates a framework exactly one square narrower than the wide format we saw in Piero di Cosimo's Nymph and the Ideal City from Baltimore. You'll notice that the vertical between the two arcs aligns with the right edge of the door in the background, and the left edge of the main square aligns with the left edge of the bar where the patrons are seated. The diagonals of the square intersect between the heads of the main couple, just grazing their cheeks. The red vertical defined by the quadrature within the main square describes the boundary between light and shadow on the back of the customer facing away from us. The customer's elbow and the bartender's eyes, meanwhile, lie on rays of a large octagon inscribing the main square. Hopper even appears to have used an octature sequence in order to locate elements such as the vertical mullion of the main bar window and the crease in the wall behind the bartender's head, as the orange constructions here show. These relationships, to my knowledge, have never been commented upon previously. A variety of claims have been made, however, for the use of geometrical armatures by other 20th century painters. Charles Boulot claimed, for example, that Piet Mondrian used such armatures governed by the golden ratio to define the compositions of paintings such as Broadway Boogie Woogie, seen here. Unfortunately, his demonstration of this principle was far less plausible than many of his other analyses, so I tried to see what I could discover in this connection. To show you these steps, I'll first fade the painting to gray so that my lines will be more visible. Here, I've just unfolded the half diagonal of the square in the painting so as to form a golden rectangle like the one seen at the beginning of my talk. The successively smaller squares constructed along this rectangle's diagonal locate the heights of the red lines shown at left, each of which forms the top margin of one of Mondrian's street light color strips. The orange rectangle at left is actually a golden rectangle in terms of proportion. Its bottom edge aligns with the lower red horizontal, and its right margin defines one of the main verticals of the painting. An arc swung up from the lower right corner of the painting rises through the intersection of this vertical and the second horizontal to height 441, a level through which I've drawn a green horizontal, which again forms the top edge of a color strip. The green rectangle and the square above this level locate the right edges of two vertical color strips. The blue square and rectangle within the green square serve a similar function on a smaller scale. A few more constructions based on diagonals locate features such as the large blue rectangle in the painting's upper right quadrant and the horizontal color strip immediately above it at height 0.842. With its insistently rectilinear articulation, Broadway Boogie Woogie might seem to represent the very antithesis of compass-based circular thinking. To the extent that its proportions were based on those of the golden rectangle, though, it contains circles below its surface, to paraphrase my soft title. In this sense, Mondrian's painting can be understood as belonging to a long sequence of artworks whose proportions and conception depended on the creation of circles. These might be overtly expressed, as at Stonehenge, expressed only partly, as in the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Strasbourg facade design, or fully hidden from view, as in many Renaissance and later paintings. Prick holes and other physical traces of compass use similarly might be quite prominent, as in the Strasbourg drawing, or frustratingly elusive, as in most of the subsequent examples I've discussed. The more I study this material, however, the more convinced I become that the compass really did play a fundamental role in pre-modern and even modern artistic creativity, and that geometrical analysis of artistic practice deserves far more sustained and systematic attention than it has received to date. For these reasons, I am deeply grateful to Megan McNamee and Sarah Griffin for organizing this conference, and to all of you for your time and attention. Thank you very much.